if you follow your passion, good things generally happen. And what's the advantage to not doing it? So if you can fit it into your life, if you can fit it around the full-time job, whatever you need to do to make room for that. And you just have to have some faith and know, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that could happen with the World's Fair documentary, all that happened was I got to talk to some really incredible people.
That was Ryan Ritchey, director of After the Fair. And you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 104 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. I hope you're all being safe and healthy out there. I know that some areas are starting to reopen, including some parks, and I hope you're able to have a great time with whatever you're doing, but please be careful, wear a mask wherever needed, and we'll all get through this. I just get nervous when I see things opening so quickly, but I know you're going to be responsible and also have some fun too. My guest today is Ryan Ritchey, who directed the documentary After the Fair about the 1964 World's Fair. He was actually the first podcast guest I ever had way back in August 2015. He is finally returning to the show. He's talking about some really exciting projects that he's working on in immersive entertainment, projection mapping, a lot of cool location-based technologies that I think could be the wave of the future. The parks are going to continue to be huge, but things we can do either at home or even in our town, I think are only going to grow, especially given just what all of us are experiencing right now. Ryan's also a big fan of Epcot Center, which of course I love talking about here on the podcast. And I'm really interested in the way that he's taken that fandom from the past and really used that, and it's motivated him to do some really cool things going forward in the future. Kind of like how Epcot looked back to World's Fairs, but also looked ahead to really new technologies. So that's really fun to hear about from Ryan. He has a lot of cool stories about how doing that passion project after the fair led to some really cool things for his career. Before I get to my conversation with Ryan, the Tomorrow Society podcast is a listener-supported show. We don't have any ads or sponsors, so anything you can do to help support the show makes a huge difference. One of the ways you can do so is through a small monthly contribution on Patreon. You can get some really cool perks, and you can find out more information about that at tomorrowsociety.com/member. I've also set up a virtual tip jar just for one-time contributions. There's nothing monthly. It's just a small way you can help keep this show going. You can find out more about that at tomorrowsociety.com/tipjar. So it's amazing how quickly time has flown by. I can't believe it's been almost 5 years since I talked to Ryan. Once again, it was a blast to do so, and I hope to talk to him again in the future to get more updates on some of the projects he's doing. Here is Ryan Ritchey. So last time, we talked about After the Fair, which now I know is available to watch on YouTube. So what made you decide to release it that way so anyone can check it out?
So it's incredible how quickly the world's changing. In 2014, as we were kind of wrapping up the movie, it just made sense at that time that, okay, well, this was an event that happened in the 60s. It's been 50 years. The audience might be a little older. So our initial distribution was really focused on DVDs, on discs. And then we put it on Vimeo as well, which there wasn't a lot of activity there as a digital download to purchase. And then, of course, fast forward 5 years, and there's a project I'm working on now, and I'm sure we won't even bother putting it on a DVD. So it kind of speaks to, how quickly the technology has moved, that it's something you don't even consider now. So I guess it's been about a month ago now from when we're recording that I decided, well, a lot of people were spending a lot of time at home, so why don't we just put this on YouTube? And we did a YouTube quote unquote premiere where some of the people who were in the movie stopped by in the chat and chatted with folks. And I'm hoping, we'll see what happens, but I'm hoping now that we can have sort of a weekly live Zoom type of thing where someone stops by from the World's Fair, from the movie, and we can talk more about the fair. And of course, as you know, there's a large Disney component to that as well.
Oh, definitely. And I think that is one thing about all of us being at home so much, is that you are seeing kind of these really cool Zoom meetings or YouTube events, Instagram, whatnot. And the fair too, for me at least, I feel like with us all being at home and kind of pausing a bit, there are a lot of people that may be looking back to kind of historical events or finding hobbies to really focus on. And I'm not sure there's a better type of hobby or event to look at than the World's Fair, especially for a certain type of person like us. So I think it's really cool that you might be doing that. And it sounds like a really fun way to keep people talking about it.
And it also ties in because, one of the big things at the fair for Bell was the picture phone. And of course, here we are, all these years later, and everyone's using that technology to communicate. And there's kind of a nice connection there between the two things.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's the thing where you start to really zone in on, like, I think about it where I'm doing my daily job or even talking to people through Skype or Zoom or everything. And it just seems so easy. And I'm like, if this had happened the same way 5 or 10 years ago, even the way that we responded to it would be so different. And given the possible length and possible resurgence of us being at home, that it could be a real challenge. But I'm curious too. I watched After the Fair again and was struck again. Like, I watched it and again looked at these pavilions and I was like, man, how I look at some of this and I'm like, this is cooler than some new attractions we're seeing now. I don't understand. So when you think back to the fair and just pavilions and all of that, like, what really sticks with you when you're looking at those pavilions and kind of what excites you now, years later?
It's interesting. I guess what you have to think about is in that time, if you think today about a brand, let's say GM, for example, they have a certain ad budget, and that budget is spread across obviously TV, radio, but a ton of money on the internet and websites and search engines and all that stuff. And when you think about the World's Fair, that was the event. And so all of the resources were really focused on how are we going to wow people? How are we going to create excitement at this limited time event? Because basically you had to, have things that would create buzz and create a lot of positive press for your brand without social media, right? Without any real way for people to tell one another other than talking, face to face or on the phone. You're not going to believe, you got to go to the World's Fair. You're not going to believe how incredible this thing was. For me, I am always fascinated by some of the non-Disney pavilions because it's just interesting to me that they got built. For example, the GM, Futurama 2, and even Futurama at the first fair, because, we didn't have theme parks. We didn't have industries that had grown up around creating these kinds of experiences. So it's always fascinating to me, and maybe in the future I'll revisit it. Who were the people behind these other attractions? We understand, sure, there's a team of Imagineers. That makes sense for the attractions Disney worked on. But some of these really big, interesting pavilions that were just done, for other companies, I really would like to know more about some of the people behind creating those.
Well, yeah, and you think about it, that Futurama 2, if you just kind of showed what that was, I would be like, this feels so familiar to me now, having gone to Epcot Center and even seeing things from Tomorrowland, especially in the earlier years, or at Disneyland, it seems so similar where you would almost think that feels like a Disney attraction. And like you said, there's so many others where so many kind of interesting film projects or robots or puppets or just things that all, and it's backwards, of course, because I'm going, well, that feels like Epcot Center. It's like, well, Dan, Epcot Center took a lot from all of this. But I find it so interesting too, because like you said, in a sense, they were kind of creating a new style of theme park attraction that was, not just in 1964, but going back, like you said, to 39 and to other events, but that was driven by these corporations, but didn't feel so hit you over the head with it. It felt like it was things that could work on their own. A lot of those, like Futurama, I'm like, yeah, I'll go there now. That's good. Let's go do that. So I think it's really cool that is there and that there's such good footage about it, because now it almost seems, I mean, you'll see every once in a while, Google did a dark ride last year at an event that was kind of cool. But in general, it's hard to think about and go, a company like a GM would, notwithstanding their connections to Epcot and Test Track or whatever, would just do their own thing at an event that felt that way. It just seems so absurd at this point.
Well, I think, you said about how it's reminiscent of Epcot and you're sort of working backwards, but I think the secret sauce to Epcot that gets lost, we think, oh, it's the future, it's optimistic, but I think what really worked for Epcot and what Epcot borrowed from those World's Fairs is that the attractions were grounded in the idea that, yeah, it's the future we're showing you, but it's here now. If you think about Universe of Energy, right? It's the early 80s, and here's a pavilion that is sponsored by an oil company, and yet there are solar cells on the roof. And as you watch and learn about energy and potential alternative energy, it's easy to think, oh, okay, someday that might happen. But no, it was happening then. You were in a ride vehicle partially powered by those cells. And so while it was about the future, it was really also grounded in here's what we have today. And if you think about sort of here's where we are on the cutting edge of today, I should say. And so when you think about what the brands wanted to do at the World's Fair, it was the same thing. GM wanted you to have the perception of where GM wanted to go, but also where they were today. To take it back to Epcot with World of Motion, and there's a GM ride, a history of transportation, great. But when it was over, you were seeing concept cars. You were seeing just the real cusp of the near future. What's here today? This wasn't some obscure vision from 200 years in the future. And so I think that Epcot borrowed many things, but I think part of the secret to its success was that I guess you could almost call it an accessible future, because we were hearing about things that would happen in the future, but it was always grounded in, and guess what? Here's something we're doing right now that you probably didn't even think we could do yet, and we're doing it. And I think that was really important at World's Fairs as well.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that about Epcot too, because sometimes the common narrative is that, well, Future World, you can't keep it updated because technology changes. And that's true, I think, in terms of how attractions are presented, that if you don't update it, it can seem kind of dated. However, I feel like I look back, you mentioned energy, which we're still now, there's a lot more solar power, but not as much as you would think. And that came out so long ago, coming up on 40 years. And a lot of Horizons too, a lot of the things haven't really happened. World of Motion, there's no futuristic city like that, like Centricore at the end. So in a way, I feel like it bridged the past and led into the future so well. Now, it still raises a question though, since we're talking a bit about Epcot, is, there's kind of a pushback overall to, people saying, well, why doesn't Disney create something like that or create something that is more focused in that way? But given just how technology has changed and how corporations don't function like they did during the World's Fair, are we just in a landscape where that couldn't happen or where it wouldn't be as popular, just given where the culture has gone in the last, 40, 50 years?
I am a strong believer that there is a place for something that would approximate Epcot Center today. I don't think it would come from Disney at this point. And another piece of the puzzle for Epcot Center that seems a little counterintuitive, I think, is that you had the participation of the sponsors. And so I think that brought an element to these attractions that grounded them a little bit in reality, but also led to even more imaginative thinking and imaginative story. How do we tell the story of again, we can go back to energy, or how do we tell the story of technology in general for GE, for example, with Horizons? And so when I think about, we've heard some of the announced changes at Epcot, and we'll see what stays and what doesn't. But when Disney is fully in control, there's no, doubting the imagination and the storytelling and the ability of the Imagineers. But with the sky being the limit, I think there's a tendency to lean more towards straight up fantasy, escapism, and entertainment, whereas Epcot always had that little bit of a grounding in reality. And so if you were doing it today, I think there's, as they say in Wall-E, to paraphrase, there's plenty of space up in space, right? I think space is one area where you could always make an attraction that could be optimistic and hopeful and show you things that are happening right now and where we could go in the future. Think about medicine, right? Right now, especially, we're all really pulling for researchers and scientists to come up with vaccines. And so, what's the story of medicine? I think there's a story there that could be told in an optimistic way that would be both entertaining and educational. So, Epcot is definitely changing because it fits more with where Disney is today, and that's okay. But I think that there's still a place for what Epcot Center tried to do, and sort of in continuing that tradition from the World's Fairs. And you had mentioned the Google ride at CES 2 years ago, I guess it was. I really think that we might start to see more of that. I do. I think that it's through a new lens now, right? Now you measure that success by, well, were the videos shared online? Did people talk about it? What was the social media score? What was the impact of that? So it's a different metric. But I think that, once we get on the other side of everything that's happening right now, I think people are going to leave their house and want to go and do things. But I think it's going to be more of an event. And I think it's got to be something that really excites you. And so rather than going to a website to learn about Google, maybe there is an in-person experience that could be exciting enough that's what I want to go and do. So I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I have a strong opinion that what we think of as what Epcot used to be could still work today if we just sort of look at it through a slightly different lens. And I don't think it's fair or realistic to think that that's what Disney would do going forward. But I do think it's possible that someone could do it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing where essentially once, I hate to say it goes back to normal because I don't think there's ever the same normal, but once the economy really starts to open up and people start to go places, there is going to be reluctance to just go back to all the typical things we might have done, like a movie theater or a sports event or something like that, or even possibly to a theme park. And you bring up a good point that if it's something that's really unique and really cool that happen maybe in your city, you might be more likely than trying to plan like a big trip that involves going somewhere with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So I like the idea, and I think technologically companies are going to have to get a little more innovative probably in order to do that, because things continue to change with how we're going to function as a society. And I know we could kind of veer off in this direction a lot further, but I like the idea because I do think that all kind of fits with Epcot Center and just the idea when you get beyond the park itself, just the optimistic future. So I think that's really interesting. And so speaking of other places that maybe doing things. I mean, obviously for me, our local science center has really done a good job of kind of having smaller little exhibits and things that kind of remind me of Epcot Center. But I know you recently went to Kennedy Space Center earlier this year. And I went there maybe about 10 years ago or so and loved it, but I know they've done so many new attractions and things since. I'm curious for you to talk about that a bit. Like, what was that like, and what things were interesting kind of in the vein we've been talking about?
Sure. So I was there earlier this year, and I hadn't been there probably 15 years or so. And when we were there the last time, there was a lot of talk about the International Space Station and, someday we're going to go to Mars. And okay, that's how it felt at the time. You sort of like, okay, that's a nice thought, but I don't see this happening anytime soon. But on this trip, what had changed was, first of all, from a pure, attraction presentation standpoint, they now have the shuttle Atlantis there, and it's not a traditional presentation of the Atlantis like you might see in the Air and Space Museum, for example. There's a story, a lead up, and a whole immersive experience to the reveal, and so it feels greatly elevated, rather than walk in, there's the shuttle, take your picture, move on. It really immerses you in the whole story of what led up to the shuttle program. So just in terms of production value, things have really increased out there compared to when I was there last. And then the other part of it, getting back to this whole idea of showing the future, but showing what's happening right now, we're back to a point where when you take the bus tour at Kennedy Space Center, you're going out to the pad that SpaceX uses. And so there's, an actual rocket, or there's people who are really working on getting us back into space and, the moon and beyond. And so it's that same idea where when you visit there now, they've really put a lot of effort into, upping their game as far as the presentation, but also just the idea that they once again are able to tap into that idea of, yes, this is the future, but it's also here now, and you can see the path from here's what's happening right now to where we want to go. And that's really, it really led to that same feeling of optimism and hope that I felt years and years ago at Epcot. It was really, really a surprisingly fun trip out there.
Yeah, and I've heard great things about the shuttle experience, which I know a local company here, PGAV, was very involved with, and it sounded like, like a high-tech theme park attraction, like something that I would love to see at any park. And I think it's really cool that they've done that. But you bring up a good point, too, about SpaceX, which kind of fits with what we talked about in terms of corporations or private companies working to be involved in this type of forward thinking. Whereas the Apollo program, there was plenty of other companies that were working with NASA, but NASA was also so powerful and had such a huge budget at the time. I just talked with Michael Crawford about this, about kind of the connections between the space program and the shuttle and Apollo leading into Epcot Center. And it's interesting now, too, because, the U.S. has not done as much with actually sending their own astronauts to space and is working with other countries and all of that. And it's much more of a worldwide effort, but it does seem to move so slowly. I mean, it's great to see that actual active things are happening there. It's not just, weren't things great in 1969 and the 70s and 80s? They could be great now. And that's, I think, fits with the whole point we're kind of talking about. Like you mentioned when you talked about energy and world of motion, things are happening now and the future, not just the past, I guess.
Right. And in other places, when you think about living with the land, when it opened, you would go through on the boat and, there are scientists right there working on stuff. They're really working on how do we do these hydroponics. And, part of that is theatricality, but part of it is also the realism with that was happening. And if it wasn't, I don't know the extent of the research that was really happening there, but I know it was happening. And so that living feeling, that it's not a static display, just what you're saying with the Space Center sort of not being so much a museum experience, looking back at the past. Obviously, there's a lot of rich history, and that's presented. But also, here's the near past, and here's what's happening today, and here's where we want to go with this. And so, I do think that maybe a company like SpaceX, they don't really right now, they're not really concerned with brand awareness and that sort of thing with the general public. But maybe 5-10 years from now, that's a private company that might want to be involved in something that approximated what Epcot once was and have a pavilion of some sort.
Yeah, that's what I always think about when I look at something like Mission Space, which I feel like has impressive technology and the scale is cool. But I seem to feel like there's something missing. Like, I don't know, it doesn't seem, they're talking about Mars and now about Earth. And it does, if there was in the future, it doesn't have to be that attraction, but a sponsor that was really driving how things change either in that attraction or something else. And it seemed to connect more to what's really happening rather than as much of technical exercise. I think that's a perfect example of how it could better connect to what's going on now and still have that corporate backing. Now, again, I don't know if Disney's really interested in that, but kind of like you're getting at, it doesn't have to be Disney. It could be completely separate.
Right. And full disclosure, I guess we'll get into this now. I was a huge Horizons fan, so I'm always going to have a little bit of a prejudice about Mission Space. But I think that's a really good example, like you're saying. It not only is it sort of a technical exercise, but I remember going on a tour, one of the I think it was the Undiscovered Future World tour there at Epcot several years back, and they talked about how the front of that attraction was designed in a modular style so they could swap out the planet. So the idea was that, once we were getting to Mars, then they would make it Jupiter or something like that. And it's sort of sad that it's gone the other direction. We've gone from going to Mars to now the simulation being just going around the Earth. And so that's kind of the opposite of, looking at where are we and where are we going. It's sort of almost regressing to, well, this makes a little more sense story-wise. And, it just kind of, I feel like the scope has shrunk on that attraction when, to your point, with new technology, with some of the stuff we're seeing, Millennium Falcon and so forth, from a technology standpoint, it could be more interactive, but also the story that it presents and the travel that it presents could be more hopeful and more optimistic of a bigger vision for space in the future.
When I went last September, I did Millennium Falcon, and doing that and Mission Space around the same time, like you did Mission Space, and I hadn't done it in a little while, and I hadn't done I know the green version is now Earth, and I remember being like, oh, and also having done Flight of Passage with just incredible visuals, and then you get in, you're kind of squished in, and it's like things have changed a lot in about 15 years. I'm sorry to say, but I agree with you that it does. That's interesting. I didn't know that about the tour of Future World and about the idea that they could change it out. Wow, they really had some good optimism there. But while we're talking about Epcot, I would like to get your thoughts on changes that were announced. And I know you referenced it earlier. I have a feeling that given that we don't even know when the parks are going to reopen, that a lot of the things they announced may not actually happen. And I'm really curious if they would even pull back completely. But I think they're still already doing construction or have the construction up. So I know they're going to do some construction there. But, the announcement was, of course, to Future World will be swapped out for these 3 areas: World Discovery, World Nature, and World Celebration. And I have such mixed feelings about this, but I'd love to get your thoughts first before I dive in. How do you feel about this type of change and the potential of it possibly?
I don't know if it's intentional or not, but I feel like there's this pattern with Disney and attractions where enough time, something will be left long enough that the majority of people will say, well, they had to do something, or, well, that was getting dated. If Future World, if Communicore, Innoventions, if those buildings had been refreshed every year with new attractions and new experiences, there'd be very few of us that would be saying, oh, well, that's been there too long. You got to get rid of that. But because it's like things sit long enough that, we're excited at the prospect of anything that could be new and different. And so I think sometimes that gives them a little more, wiggle room than we might like. And I guess that's all my long way around to saying that it's bittersweet because it's not what I would do. It's not what I think of with Epcot, but the fact of the matter is that idea is just not really in the cards going forward, I don't believe, as Epcot as we fondly remember. And so if we're really serious about that being something that we feel needs to be in the world, I think it's going to have to come from somewhere else. From a creative standpoint, from a, Imagineering standpoint, the ideas seemed solid. Okay, a path with water features, the Moana thing. Okay, that's fine, but it's fine. I'm not feeling like that would be terribly inspiring. I'm sure it would be a lovely place to visit. I'm sure kids would love it, and it would look lovely. But I just really feel bittersweet about it because I feel like it shouldn't be a surprise, the changes that are being made and sort of the direction they're going. But at the same time, I think what we all need to realize, and this sound a little hokey, but I think what we need to realize is that hope and optimism we used to get from Epcot and Epcot Center, it's up to us now. We took that hope and optimism. It wouldn't really make sense if 40 years later, people were going to Epcot and still thinking, wow, these vehicles are on a little wire and there's solar panels on the roof. Like, if that's still a surprise, then it didn't really work out. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like we have to take what we felt and that optimism and that feeling at Epcot in those early years and both apply to our own lives. But, really think about if Epcot didn't exist, what would it look like if we were building it today from scratch? And really, what would that experience be like? Because I don't think we're going to get something like that again. I think, Epcot is a little bit of a outlier when you look at all of the parks in the world, really. So I don't think that going forward, it's going to be what those of us who visited Epcot in the 80s and 90s, what we liked about it. I just don't think that's the kind of attraction and the kind of thing that's going to be built there. But I got to stress, that doesn't mean it's not going to be good or that it's not going to be a good time. I just think that it's going to be different.
All of that makes sense. I don't think you're being overly negative or cynical about any of it because your points are accurate. I mean, man, it kills me because if they had really pulled the trigger and done Westcott, and then you had two parks that were of a different but of a similar mold, I think then it might be a different situation. And who knows it could have been a disaster and bankrupted the company. I don't know. But basically, I think it would have put it in stone where then you didn't just have this one outlier, because even something like Disney's Animal Kingdom, which I think they've done some cool things with, it's not just a zoo, but there are a lot of zoos that are putting in more themed entertainment or things similar. So there's not such a difference between the Animal Kingdom and a lot of places we've been. Whereas Epcot, yes, you could say there are science museums and Kennedy Space Center, but it's still kind of its own thing in a way. What they tried to do, take this idea from Walt and then kind of convert it in the way they did. But one thing that I will say that I find a little reassuring is when they have this split. World Celebration to me, whatever, that doesn't really mean anything. But World Nature, I'm like, okay, when I hear that, I look and I go, then they're likely to keep the land. And if you set aside the Goofy Nemo Dark Ride, you're at least going to have a pavilion because of the Living Seas in some way, which are things that I think do tie back to what Epcot Center was doing. I think those will likely stay in place in some form. And even Discovery, you could think of things like space. I know that's where the Guardians of the Galaxy are going, but you could look at things like space and even Test Track, with some of the futuristic things there. And you say, okay, I can see what they can do there. So I don't feel like it's a killer, but I agree that in a way, it's like I go in going, well, it could have been a lot worse, when they made the announcement. And I hate to be that way, but it's part of me is like, at least if they have cohesion and unity, it'll be different than right now where I feel like pavilion to pavilion, there's none of that. But I agree that I don't want to be someone to say, wow, when this gets done, and who knows, I assume that the Moana walkthrough will actually happen. We shall see. But when this all gets done, it's all going to make sense and be something similar. I just hope it's something, like you said, that's a cool park that kind of all fits together well, which would be a step in the right direction. But I want to make sure we get to other things that you're doing, which you are doing a lot, which I think is really exciting on its own. So, but even so, before that, I know after the fair, I know you also got involved working on Mystery Science Theater 3000, which I think is really cool. And I'd love to hear your story about how that ended up happening for you.
Sure. So, it's one of those things where you never know how the dots are going to connect till you look back. And, I have, when you take on a project that you're doing mainly for yourself, whether it's self-funded or a passion project or whatever it is, you don't know where it's going to lead. And there are times when you can have doubt about whether it's worth doing or what's going to happen with it. And when I worked on the World's Fair documentary, one of the major reasons I did it was because I knew, and I know you've said this about your podcast, I knew I would get to talk to interesting people. And I got to, sit down with Rolly Crump and Marty Sklar and Bob Gurr and those guys. And that was incredible. And I would have never had any excuse to have that happen. But the other thing that I would say to people out there who are, trying to find their passion and follow their passion is that you never know where it's going to lead professionally either. And so with the After the Fair documentary, when that was over, a little bit later, I was reading an article. There was this company working on a new kind of propulsion for rockets, and I saw that the press contact was Joel Hodgson, and I thought, gosh, I wonder, is that Joel Hodgson from Mystery Science Theater? And I did some research, and it turned out it was. And so I kind of I reached out to him under the guise, although I was interested in doing a documentary about what the company was working on, a little, documentary. Hey, if they're going to make the future of space propulsion, I want to be on the ground floor and do this documentary. Well, we had some emails back and forth, and then he asked if there was any of my work that he could see. And so I sent him After the Fair. And it turns out that, he's a bit of a World's Fair aficionado, always been interested in it. Once upon a time, he was kind of planning to do this World's Fair thing, I believe, with his brother many years ago. And so this was all an email. And then one day he called me and he said, well, it's Joel from the company. I said, yes. And he said, so I don't know if you ever heard of it, but I used to be involved with a show called Mystery Science Theater. And I played it cool. I said, yes, I'm familiar, Joel. I've been familiar this whole time. And then he kind of laid out how they were planning to bring the show back and the plan to do the Kickstarter and all that. So based on seeing my work from After the Fair and getting to know me, I ended up as an associate producer on the reboot on Netflix, and then also doing some stuff for the live tours that followed. And we're doing as we're recording, we're getting ready to do a riff along online through Zoom. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes. But, that was a situation where professionally I benefited from following a passion and having that passion be the thing I was able to hold up to someone for a professional gig, which has done the same thing now in terms of, meeting people I would have never met and working on a show for Netflix, which who knows how long or if I would have ever done that otherwise. And obviously that certainly was not part of the plan with the documentary 5+ years ago. But it's just really, a testament to you never know where one thing will lead. And so, go with your heart and do the passion you really want to do and see where that leads.
Wow, it's so interesting how that all came together. It just shows too how things are. The fact that he was working as a press contact, it's like, really? That guy? That's funny that he's he's talking about this show like it's like, oh yeah, it's this thing that nobody really knows about, and there are people, so many are just obsessed with Mystery Science Theater well before the reboot. So I think it's great that you got to work on that, because I mean, what are the odds of doing something about the World's Fair and ending up working on this other show? It's crazy.
Sure. And, like I said, it just goes to show you that if you follow your passion, good things generally happen. And what's the advantage to not doing it? So if you can fit it into your life, if you can fit it around the full-time job, whatever you need to do to make room for that. And you just have to have some faith and know, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that could happen with the World's Fair documentary, all that happened was I got to talk to some really incredible people. And once you realize that, then it sort of frees you to work on projects. And that's sort of where I'm going with future projects too. So we'll see if that continues to be the case. But I'm a firm believer that following your passion leads to more positive places than you'd expect.
Yes, this is all very familiar to me, this idea of doing a passion project on the side. So it might relate, but I'd love to hear about some other things. I know you've been working on some projects with 360-degree filmmaking and VR production. So what have you been doing in that realm that you can talk about?
So about 2 years ago now, I really became interested in 360 and VR and that sort of stuff. But to back up a step, so when we were talking about Epcot and everything, if it wasn't obvious, I grew up a huge fan of the theme parks, especially Epcot. And, at some point in my life, I wanted to be doing something in the themed entertainment world. Now, when you're 17 and you're growing up in a small town, at that point, the best I could do was work at a radio station. And I did that while I went to college. And then eventually, what's a little bit closer? I guess video production's a little bit closer. So as time went on, I'm not getting any younger. And I thought, well, gee, if I really want to try to get into this industry, I need to just do it. And so I started thinking, okay, well, what's some of the most accessible ways to start thinking about theme park attractions, location-based entertainment that build on my skill sets? And so with that background in video, that led to working on 360 video for in VR headsets, and then a little bit of, VR production. And so that's sort of where I've been spending my time. I've done some proof of concepts for some major companies. And it's interesting because, the last 18 months or so, there was interest in VR, but not today. Maybe not today was sort of the feeling I got. These headsets are bulky. And then you fast forward to today, and, you had mentioned how different everyone being home would have been just 5 or 10 years ago. And I think, well, how different would it be 5 or 10 years in the future? Because now a lot of these companies, it's a little too late for now, but they're reaching out and saying, oh, wait, that VR thing, what was that all about again? Because, we're seeing it as, is there a way that we can be doing education, let's say, that maybe works better in VR versus just a video conference? Or is there a way we can do training, or let's say sales calls with doctors for pharmaceutical companies? Just is there a way to use this technology? So again, there's sort of this uptick in interest. However, I didn't have the best timing as I decided, okay, well, let's take what we're learning here with 360 video and VR, and let's start work internally sort of on a proof of concept mixed reality experience. It's a hot air balloon experience, and there's a 360 screen, and we're going to be using mixed reality glasses, and you travel through time, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Of course, this is a terrible time in terms of trying to start a location-based entertainment business, because I don't know, how soon, if ever, people are going to be confident in sharing, let's say, VR headsets. No matter how much you say, oh, we wipe them down and all that, that might be something that disappears for a while. But because it's a passion, I'm sticking with it, because I know that, if it leads down another path, that's okay. But for now, this, along with moving to projection mapping in particular, what we want to do is look at how can we take those wonderful castle shows at Disney or the Harry Potter show at Universal, and how do we maybe bring that down to a level where some smaller amusement parks and theme parks can really capitalize on that and have their own, amazing shows. So that's kind of the quick overview of what we've been working on lately.
Well, I think too, you mentioned, yes, that in the very near future, there's going to be a hesitance for any type of basically anything that involves leaving your house, essentially. But I do think that working on it now makes a lot of sense because, one, you're going to be out in front of something and things are changing so quickly that, like we talked about earlier, there may be a case where someone wants to go to something locally because people are going to leave their houses. Eventually it's going to happen rather than something big. So I think it might really be something positive that could be great for when we start to venture that way. And also too, how much the big attractions for the big players like Disney Universal cost. Those attractions are now up there where I think the Guardians coaster, they're like, oh, we're going to spend $300 million. And I think I might be undershooting it. And like you mentioned, regional players or even you think about zoos, science centers, whatever, they don't have that kind of money. So I think there's going to be more of a market, and I think there already is, but going forward into, like you said, location-based attractions or even smaller parks trying to find ways to give those experiences beyond just the typical flat rides or spinners or things we've seen a million times.
And also on the hardware side, if there have been rumors for years that Apple might be working on an AR headset of some sort. So if some of the major players step up and we get these headsets down to a more manageable size, it might even be a thing where people are coming with their own headset. Maybe there's an experience that you can only do at a particular place, and people do come together for that, and they have the comfort of they're not sharing equipment, or if they're stuck at home, there are plenty of experiences that could be created where, you can interact with people from home. I know we've worked with some of the people on my team with using the headsets for meetings, and it's interesting. It is more engaging than a Zoom, and it's less stressful because in that environment, you're usually using avatars rather than seeing each other. And when you're in a Zoom call, for example, there's that feeling that you're always on, that you're on the camera, and it's kind of exhausting. But there's more of a laid back feel to it that almost more approximates being with your coworkers in physical space or being with your friends. And so I think now, especially, you might see companies like Apple maybe accelerate development of things like AR headsets. It's interesting to think that, the iPod came out in October, I believe it was, of 2001. Now, talk about bad timing, right? It's the economy and everything then. But Apple was of the belief that they needed to keep moving forward and keep innovating. And I think that's something for all of us to keep in mind. The Walt Disney Company, really took off through the Great Depression. And there's always going to be a need to connect with others. There's always going to be a need for storytelling and for experience. It's just human nature. And so when I think about all of the industries out there, entertainment, themed entertainment, immersive entertainment, those are some of the things that I think long-term are really going to stick. I've joked before that, we're going to be watching video until the earth goes into the sun. It's that kind of thing where, we want to see stories, we want to see video, we want to have experiences. It's just part of human nature. And so I really like playing with the VR. I like playing with 360 video and seeing, okay, we're making experiences that could be immersive enough and engaging enough that you would go somewhere. But we also want to look at, well, if the technology goes the way we think it will, how can we make a really incredible experience that you can do from home and share with friends and family around the world?
The communal aspect is really interesting to me because you sometimes think of VR headsets as a solo experience, like you're playing a game and it's this idea that you're wearing that and you're kind of separate from the world in a weird way, where the way you describe it, I mean, I used to work for a company that did tons of video conferences, and it was so stressful because you were always sitting there like, am I sitting up straight? Am I looking at the camera? Am I not making a weird face? And, I don't really do that now, but with Zoom, same thing, like you mentioned. But the idea of kind of being able to interact, but not in a different way and kind of a fun way too, because everybody has their own avatars and they can have a little fun with it. And it's not so static, because Zoom calls for serious companies can be a little bit like everyone's staring at their computers looking very serious. And I'm speaking very general here. I'm not talking about every company. But so I think it's really cool to think about it too, beyond just theme parks. Like for it to have practical business applications, I think is really cool. So I think it's really exciting, and I'm excited to see where it goes. And two, I don't want to gloss over projection mapping, because I know you're doing some interesting things there. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what you've been doing and where you want to go there if you can.
Sure. So with projection mapping, I've always enjoyed the projection mapping shows, and I always thought that, gosh, there's got to be a way to sort of democratize this, that even if you don't have the big, huge laser projectors that are required for the kinds of shows that Disney puts on and Universal puts on, is there a way to do this on a smaller scale? And so I started by looking at, was there a way to do this on a really small scale? So I just started with a standard desktop projector like you would have in a conference room. And one of our first proof of concepts was using a setup with medicine bottles that were painted white and a little screen behind them. And the idea was we were projecting sort of the story of this company onto those bottles and onto the screen. And it was intended to be something small enough that you could put at a trade show, at a booth, and that sort of thing. And so that has sort of now, I've literally started small, and now we're doing multi-projector things and things intended largely indoors for now. Probably the maximum scale we would have is if you think about something like the Epcot experience, the preview of what was coming to Epcot right now with the 360 screen and the projection mapping on the model in the middle. That's kind of probably the high end of the kind of stuff we would be creating. So it's really, how do we make smaller scale stuff for some of the smaller parks, and maybe start exploring small outdoor shows with them as well. So I'm sort of using the same model as we've done before. So in June, I'm going to start a podcast called Projected Futures. And what we're going to do is, it's my excuse to talk to the people who know how to do this, who have been doing it for years. Because when you think about projection mapping, your audience might immediately think of theme parks, but there are things like concerts. There are VJs. These are used at electronic music events and that sort of thing. So it's a really wide gamut of companies and also artists. A lot of artist installations use projection mapping as well. So I just really want to sort of bring that whole community together. There isn't really a standout projection mapping podcast. So I'm hoping to sort of bring everyone together and sort of get a feel for what is the equipment people are using? What are some of the hurdles? How do you handle weather? How do you handle client demands? All the business side stuff and the technical stuff, and to do that through interviews of people who have been doing it for years. So, and who knows where that will lead? It might be something completely different, but again, at the very least, it will mean a lot of conversations with interesting people.
Yeah, and I'll admit that I know almost nothing about how projection mapping works. So that will interest me as someone who's just has seen some of the shows and really has no technical knowledge at all about that or most things. So this will be really exciting. So I want to circle back. I know we've talked mostly about the future and about technology, but last time when we spoke, you talked about how you were working on a documentary called More Than a Lark, which was about Willow Grove Park near Philadelphia. And I know that that's still kind of been ongoing, but I'd love to hear from you about how that project's come together and kind of where it is right now.
Sure. So More Than a Lark was about the former Willow Grove Park amusement park, which in terms of acreage, once upon a time was bigger than Disneyland. And it was one of the trolley parks that was formed by one of the trolley companies in Philadelphia in the late 1800s. For those who aren't familiar with the trolley park, basically, the trolley companies were looking for a way to increase weekend revenue. They had lots of passengers who needed to go in and out of the city for work, but they needed some place for them to go on the weekend. And so they would, out at the end of the trolley lines, out in the countryside, create these parks. And initially, Willow Grove Park was very much a scenic park, a lot of flowers and trees and a lot of bucolic areas to walk around. But then they started to add amusement park attractions. So it's an interesting story. And what's been happening with that project is it has proven more difficult than I expected to find footage of the park. It's one of those things where people who lived near the park took it for granted, essentially. It would be people visiting who would might bring a home movie camera or take photos. And so it's very hard to find, or harder than anticipated, to find video and photos of the park, film from the park. It closed in the late 1970s. So a lot of that footage is, wasting away in attics in other cities, out in Pittsburgh or other places where people would come to Willow Grove for the day. So that project is it's on the back burner, but I've had a lot of time at home lately, and one of the things I'm looking at is can we possibly sort of break it up into chapters and maybe take a look at the first 10 years, because the first 10 years of the park there are a lot of postcards and a lot of illustrations and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of visual to support the story. So I think we're going to start looking at how can we do this in chapters and release it online. And of course, it all connects, because ideally at some point I want to look at how can we recreate these experiences? How can we bring back the World's Fair? How can we bring back what was Willow Grove Park virtually in a way that really touches you emotionally and isn't just looking at the buildings and saying, oh, wow, that really looks like what the building looked like. How do we do it at a level that people really connect with? So that's sort of the big picture look at it. But Willow Grove is not, it's on hold, but it's still chugging along in the background.
Yeah, well, I think it kind of fits with everything we've been talking about, where you're looking at the past of a park, but then you talked about possibly using newer technology to present it. It's kind of like what we mentioned with Epcot and everything we've been going through, which for me is cool because it's kind of like what Epcot Center did. And I think you've got a lot of really exciting projects that you're working on that I hope come to fruition. And it's been awesome to talk with you. So I know that you're doing so many different things. So Ryan, if there's certain places where listeners should go to keep up with what you're doing or even to learn more, what are some places they should go to?
Sure. Well, we're going to have the new projection mapping podcast going up any day now, so people can check that out at projectedfutures.net. We're also starting to do a series of short videos about the World's Fair, and those will be on our YouTube channel at World's Fair Movie.
Well, excellent. Well, I'll make sure to list all of the links that I have in the show notes. And Ryan, this has been awesome. I feel like there's a lot of exciting things coming, which is always good to hear given how things are currently going in the world. So thanks, Ryan. And it was a blast to talk with you again.
Thank you, Dan. Let's do it again in 100 episodes.
There's a lot of cool stuff happening right now here at the Tomorrow Society. I just inaugurated my new project called Friday Night Movies, where I'm going to look back at Disney's animated films, some MCU films, and other live-action wild cards. It's going to be really fun. You can find out more by going to tomorrowsociety.com/Friday Night Movies. I've also had some really cool interviews with Michael Crawford, Leslie Iwerks, Brand Farron, so many others, and I have a lot of exciting things on the way. You can catch up with all the episodes by going to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I'll be talking with Todd McCartney, one of the hosts of the Retro Disney World podcast, about Horizons Revisited, restoring old films, so many cool things that those guys are doing. Thanks so much for listening. Please stay safe out there, and I'll be talking with you again very soon.